In January 1944, the Eastern Front of World War II remained a crucible of attritional combat. Soviet High Command, Stavka, sought to take advantage of its momentum following the successful crossings of the Dnieper and the collapse of German defensive lines. The region west of the Dnieper River near Korsun and Cherkasy in central Ukraine had become a salient held by elements of Army Group South, including parts of the 8th Army. These positions served as an exposed bulge, some 100 kilometers wide, jutting into Soviet lines and offering an opportunity for encirclement. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Generals Nikolai Vatutin and Ivan Konev identified this configuration as resembling the strategic trap set at Stalingrad and proposed a double envelopment. By late December 1943, as Army Group South's Field Marshal Erich von Manstein prepared to defend the Panther-Wotan line, German forces, as a result, only 2 corps, including X's Corps under General Wilhelm Stemmermann and X-Twice's Corps under General Lieb, plus Corps Detachment B, occupied a salient west of Cherkasy that extended toward the town of Kanev, with Korsun at its center. These formations faced the threat of being cut off. At this juncture, the Soviet 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts were fully committed, each fielding substantial resources. Estimates indicate that Soviet strength comprised approximately 336,700 men, 524 initial tanks, later reinforced by another 400, over 1,000 aircraft, and upwards of 5,300 artillery pieces and mortars. Against them stood roughly 60,000 German soldiers within the pocket, supported by 59 tanks and about 242 artillery pieces. These numbers represented a stark contrast in fire. Second, it would emblematically mirror prior successes, earning both military and propaganda value. Soviet narratives framed the operation as a second Stalingrad, reinforcing the image of inexorable advance and encirclement doctrine based on deep operations. On the German side, the exposed position prompted urgent warnings. Manstein repeatedly urged Hitler to authorize a withdrawal, which was consistently denied. Despite Hitler's refusal to evacuate, the German staff anticipated the danger but lacked command authority to act preemptively. When Soviet preparations commenced, high-level visits to local command posts confirmed that German units were aware of imminent danger but constrained by orders to hold ground. Public sentiment on the Soviet side, while difficult to quantify, was shaped by recent victories and unwavering propaganda that emphasized the inevitability of liberation. Morale was high among Red Army soldiers and the Ukrainian population, eager for relief from German occupation. For Germans, confidence faded as their position grew increasingly untenable and supplies dwindled. This set the stage for the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky offensive, ordered by Stavka for late January 1944. Soviet planning focused on creating a double ring, an inner encirclement formed by the 27th, 52nd, and 4th Guards armies, and an outer sealing ring created by armored exploitation elements, including the 5th Guards Tank Army, the 6th Tank Army, supported by coordinated fronts and deception measures. With preparatory steps, deception, and massed reserves in place, Soviet forces were poised to collapse the pocket. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test Soviet envelopment tactics and German resilience amidst dire operational constraints. The Korsun-Shevchenkovsky operation began on 24 January 1944, when the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts launched their coordinated assault on the German salient. The initial Soviet strikes opened with powerful artillery barrages, lasting up to 2 hours in some sectors, aimed at destroying frontline positions, communication centers, and artillery batteries. This preparation was immediately followed by infantry advances supported by tanks and self-propelled guns, with aircraft from the 2nd and 5th Air Armies conducting ground attack missions against German strongpoints and supply routes. From the north, the 1st Ukrainian Front's 27th and 40th Armies advanced towards Zvenihorodka and Shpola, targeting the flank of the XE Corps. South of the salient, the 2nd Ukrainian Front's 4th Guards and 53rd Armies, supported by the 5th Guards Tank Army and the 5th Guards Cavalry Corps, struck toward the town of Lysyanka, aiming to link with northern forces and cut the main German escape routes. The offensive was structured for rapid encirclement. Infantry formations would punch through, while mobile units exploited the gaps to seal the pocket as quickly as possible. German forces under Generals Stemmermann and Lieb reacted by pulling available reserves into blocking positions. Elements of the 5th SS Panzer Division, Wiking, and the 1st Panzer Division were shifted to threatened sectors, conducting immediate counterattacks to slow Soviet advances. These actions bought time, but came at a high cost in men and vehicles, as Soviet artillery and airstrikes disrupted their movements and inflicted mounting losses. By 26th January, Soviet breakthroughs were evident in several sectors. Northern spearheads captured key villages and road junctions, cutting lateral communication between German units. In the south, the advance moved faster than anticipated, with cavalry mechanized groups bypassing heavily defended points to strike deeper into the rear. The speed of the southern thrust forced German supply columns and rear area units into hasty withdrawals, abandoning equipment and stores to avoid encirclement. Weather conditions complicated operations for both sides. The thawing ground turned roads into mud, slowing vehicle movement and making resupply difficult. Soviet armored units struggled to maintain pace, while German withdrawal movements were hampered by the same terrain, limiting the ability to reposition forces quickly. By 28th January, the leading elements of the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts were within striking distance of each other near Zvenihorodka and Lysyanka. Soviet command ordered all available mechanized and cavalry reserves forward to complete the encirclement. German radio intercepts confirmed the danger, but higher command continued to insist on holding the salient, even as the operational situation deteriorated rapidly. On 28 to 29 January, Soviet forward detachments linked up east of Zvenihorodka, closing the ring around roughly 60,000 German troops. Inside the newly formed pocket were elements of 6 divisions, including Panzer Grenadier, infantry, and Waffen-SS units, along with artillery, engineers, and support personnel. The inner Soviet ring began consolidating positions, while the outer defensive ring moved to block any German relief attempt from the west. The opening phase of the operation had succeeded in isolating a major German force in central Ukraine. For the Soviets, the challenge now shifted to tightening the encirclement and eliminating the trapped troops before they could organize a breakout or be relieved from outside. For the Germans, survival would depend on immediate coordination between the pocketed forces and Army Group South's mobile reserves before the Soviet positions became impregnable. The strategic objectives for both sides became sharply defined once the encirclement was complete at the end of January 1944. For the Soviet command, the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky operation was intended not only to destroy the German grouping inside the pocket, but also to break the defensive coherence of Army Group South across central Ukraine. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, coordinating the actions of the First and Second Ukrainian fronts, emphasized the necessity of maintaining tight inner and outer encirclement rings, using mobile reserves to repel relief attempts, and applying constant pressure to prevent the defenders from reorganizing. Stavka orders specified that the inner ring would be held primarily by rifle divisions supported by artillery and mortars, while the outer ring, positioned several kilometers beyond, would be reinforced with tank and mechanized corps, ready to counterattack German relief forces. The German objective was immediate and singular: extract the encircled forces of Crises and Extontetessen Corps before Soviet pressure could annihilate them. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, proposed a relief operation from the west involving the 3rd Panzer Corps under General Hermann Breith. This corps, including the 1st, 16th, and 17th Panzer Divisions, was to break through Soviet lines near Lysyanka and establish contact with the pocket. Inside the encirclement, General Wilhelm Stemmermann organized a defense in depth, concentrating available tanks, assault guns, and artillery at potential breakout points, while ordering the destruction of non-essential equipment to conserve fuel and ammunition. Logistical conditions heavily influenced both planning and execution. For the Soviets, supply lines stretched back through difficult winter terrain, requiring constant effort to bring forward ammunition, food, and fuel. Field depots were established close to the front to ensure uninterrupted bombardment and armored support. The Germans faced far more severe constraints. Fuel stocks were critically low, limiting the mobility of panzers and motorized units. Artillery ammunition was rationed, and air resupply, conducted by the Luftwaffe, was hampered by weather and Soviet fighter opposition. Between 30 January and 5 February, German aircraft made multiple sorties into the pocket, but the total tonnage delivered fell far short of operational needs. Doctrinally, Soviet forces applied the cauldron battle model perfected at Stalingrad. Prevent breakout by creating layered defenses, divide the pocket into smaller segments, and reduce them with coordinated infantry, artillery, and air power. Mobile groups were held in readiness to react to sudden enemy concentrations. German doctrine: relief forces would probe for weak points, and the pocketed troops would launch local counterattacks to shorten the distance to friendly lines. Propaganda became an additional instrument in this phase. Soviet loudspeaker teams and leaflet drops urged German soldiers to surrender, promising humane treatment. These messages also emphasized the futility of resistance, citing the destruction of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. German propaganda, in turn, framed the situation as a repeat of the 1942 Demyansk relief, assuring troops that breakout and survival were possible if discipline was maintained. Misjudgments were already apparent. The Soviet command underestimated the speed and determination with which German relief forces could regroup and counterattack. Conversely, German planners miscalculated the time available before Soviet tightening of the encirclement, made a link-up almost impossible. Each side committed to its respective plan with urgency, knowing that the coming weeks would decide whether the Korsun pocket would become another catastrophic loss or an improbable escape. By early February, both the relief offensive and Soviet efforts to seal the pocket were set in motion, bringing the battle into its most dynamic phase. The first major clashes inside and around the Korsun pocket began in the opening days of February 1944, as both Soviet and German forces moved to implement their operational plans. Within the encirclement, German troops of Ienoit's Corps and Ex-Tuspau's Corps, totaling about 60,000 men, organized defensive sectors anchored on key villages such as Steblev, Shenderovka, and Novobuda. These positions were fortified with trench networks, machine gun nests, and anti-tank obstacles. Limited numbers of armored vehicles, including artillery, was concentrated in mobile batteries to respond to threats on any sector, though ammunition shortages already forced strict fire discipline. On the Soviet side, the inner ring of encirclement, held by elements of the 27th, 52nd, and 4th Guards armies, began systematic probing attacks against German positions, aiming to identify weak points and disrupt defensive coordination. Artillery barrages preceded most assaults, targeting known gun emplacements and supply dumps. Infantry advanced in battalion-sized units, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns where terrain allowed. The Soviets sought to compress the pocket steadily, forcing German troops into a smaller area and making them more vulnerable to concentrated fire. The outer ring, manned by mobile units of the 5th Guards Tank Army, the 6th Tank Army, and cavalry mechanized groups, faced the challenge of holding off German relief efforts. The 30 Panzer Corps began its advance from the west on 4th February, pushing through Soviet positions near Lysyanka. Supported by the 1st, 16th, and 17th Panzer Divisions, the relief force fought a series of engagements against Soviet mechanized corps. Early progress was made in some sectors, with German spearheads capturing several villages and inflicting losses on Soviet armor. However, each gain was met with counterattacks, and the difficult winter terrain slowed the movement of heavy vehicles. Inside the pocket, morale among German troops was mixed. While discipline remained generally intact, the realization of their isolation weighed heavily. Rations were reduced, and fuel shortages curtailed mobility, forcing units to rely on horse-drawn transport for artillery and supplies. Medical services were strained by the growing number of wounded, and evacuation was limited to the few. Luftwaffe transport missions dropped supplies, but Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire reduced their effectiveness. The tonnage delivered daily, often less than 50 tons, was insufficient to sustain full combat operations. Civilians in the encircled area were caught between the two armies. Many fled into surrounding countryside, while others sheltered in cellars as fighting passed through their villages. Requisitioning of food and livestock by both sides worsened shortages, and artillery fire destroyed homes and infrastructure. By 6th February, Soviet attacks had reduced the size of the pocket, forcing German units to abandon outer defensive positions and withdraw toward a central line running through Shenderovka and Novobuda. These withdrawals shortened the front but increased troop density, making concealment harder and artillery bombardments more lethal. At the same time, the outer Soviet ring absorbed repeated blows from the 30 Panzer Corps, which advanced slowly, but was now within 20 kilometers of the pocket's edge in some places. The stage was set for a critical confrontation between the German relief thrust and Soviet blocking forces, with the fate of the encircled troops hanging in the balance. Between 7 and 10 February 1944, the battle for the Korsun pocket intensified into a full-scale crisis for both sides. Inside the encirclement, German forces consolidated along a defensive perimeter anchored on the villages of Shenderovka, Novo Buda, and Komarovka. These strongpoints were prepared for all-around defense, with interlocking fields of fire and anti-tank gun positions covering approach routes. The German command under General Stemmermann concentrated its remaining armored vehicles. Fewer than 2 artillery ammunition was now so limited that each battery received strict fire quotas, and only major Soviet attacks justified opening fire. Soviet forces of the inner ring continued systematic pressure. The 27th and 52nd Armies launched daily assaults on German positions, each preceded by concentrated artillery fire. Infantry battalions attacked in waves, supported by T-34s and Su-76 self-propelled guns where the ground allowed. While some gains were made, capturing outlying hamlets and pushing back forward trenches, the fighting was costly. Soviet casualties mounted as German units used well-sighted defenses and counterattacks to reclaim ground temporarily lost. Nevertheless, the shrinking perimeter meant German defenders were forced into an ever tighter space, increasing vulnerability to concentrated bombardments. Outside the pocket, the 3rd Panzer Corps pressed its relief effort. On 8 February, the 1st and 16th Panzer Divisions advanced toward the Gniloy-Tikich River, breaking through initial Soviet blocking positions and capturing several villages. Soviet mechanized and tank corps responded with counterattacks, forcing the Germans into intense armor engagements in freezing, snow-covered fields. These battles inflicted losses on both sides. The Germans destroyed a number of Soviet tanks, but lost precious panzers themselves, further reducing their already stretched armored strength. Progress slowed as Soviet resistance stiffened, particularly around the villages of Oktyabr and Cherepakovka, where dug-in infantry supported by anti-tank artillery blocked the main approaches. Inside the encirclement, German morale was now under severe strain. Supply shortages became critical. Bread rations fell to 200 grams per man per day. Fuel was reserved for essential troop movements, and medical units were overwhelmed. Luftwaffe supply missions continued, but suffered high losses, with Soviet Yak fighters and anti-aircraft fire downing several Ju-52 transports and He-111 bombers. The tonnage delivered dropped further, with many supply canisters falling into Soviet-controlled territory. Civilians in the area endured constant hardship. Many were displaced from their homes by the fighting or compelled to assist in building fortifications. Food was scarce, and livestock had largely been requisitioned. Those remaining in villages faced daily shelling, and wells were often contaminated or destroyed in the combat. By 10th February, the gap between the outer Soviet ring and the German relief spearheads had narrowed to less than 15 kilometers in some sectors. However, this was still too far for a coordinated breakout without exposing the encircled troops to devastating Soviet fire. Stemmermann's forces prepared for the possibility of launching their own breakout toward the west, timing it to coincide with the expected arrival of the 30 Panzer Corps. Soviet High Command recognized the danger and reinforced blocking positions with additional tank brigades and artillery batteries, determined to hold the encirclement intact. The battle was entering a decisive phase in which speed, coordination, and the ability to endure attrition would decide the outcome. From 11 to 14 February 1944, the Korsun pocket reached the peak of its intensity as both Soviet and German commands committed their remaining reserves to decisive actions. Inside the encirclement, General Stemmermann reorganized the XT and X-23 Corps into a compact strike force oriented toward the southwest, aiming at the line between Lysyanka and infantry divisions were pulled back from less threatened sectors to reinforce the planned breakout zone, leaving only thin screens in the east and north to hold off Soviet attacks. All remaining tanks, fewer than 15 operational, were concentrated with the intent of punching a gap for the infantry and supply columns to follow. The Soviets, aware of the German focus, intensified pressure along the entire perimeter to prevent force concentration. The 27th and 52nd Armies struck the northern and eastern faces of the pocket with heavy artillery preparation followed by infantry assaults. Though these attacks were costly and made limited ground, they fixed significant German manpower away from the breakout sector. On the southern and western edges, elements of the 4th Guards Army and Mechanized Corps established successive defensive belts, integrating anti-tank guns, minefields, and artillery positions to absorb and halt any escape attempt. Outside the pocket, the 3rd Panzer Corps made another concerted push toward Lysyanka on 12th of February. The 1st Panzer Division advanced along the main road under constant Soviet artillery fire, while the 16th and 17th Panzer Divisions maneuvered to envelop Soviet blocking forces from the flanks. The fighting was intense, with Soviet tank brigades launching repeated counterattacks to blunt the advance. In several engagements, German spearheads advanced only a few kilometers before being halted by dense anti-tank defenses. The terrain, churned by thaw and snow, restricted movement and left vehicles vulnerable to well-placed Soviet gunners. Air power played a decisive role during these days. The Luftwaffe concentrated on close air support for the relief forces and supply drops to the pocket. Despite Soviet air superiority, German fighter escorts enabled some transport. However, the quantities were still insufficient to restore full combat effectiveness. The 2nd and 5th Soviet Air Armies targeted German armored concentrations and rear area logistics, destroying fuel trucks and delaying reinforcements to the front. Conditions within the pocket deteriorated further. Food stocks were nearly exhausted, with soldiers subsisting on half rations or less. Fuel shortages forced the abandonment of some vehicles, which were destroyed to prevent capture. Medical facilities operated beyond capacity, and many wounded could not be evacuated. Morale was sustained only by the hope that the relief force would soon break through. By 14th of February, the German relief thrust had reached within 10 kilometers of the pocket's outer edge. For a brief period, there appeared to be a realistic chance of linking up. Soviet commanders, however, reinforced the gap with additional units from the 5th Guards Tank Army and artillery. The battles west of Lysyanka became a series of brutal engagements in which each side fought for control of individual villages, ridge lines, and road junctions. The peak of the campaign was marked by unrelenting combat, mounting casualties, and rapid shifts in tactical situations. Both sides recognized that the next few days would determine whether the Korsun pocket would be broken open or whether its defenders would be forced into a desperate attempt to escape under fire. The operational clock was running out for the German command, as Soviet tightening of the encirclement threatened to close off all remaining options. Between 15 and 16 February 1944, the German forces inside the Korsun pocket and the three Panzer Corps outside, it adapted their operations to the rapidly closing window for a breakout. General Stemmermann, in coordination with Field Marshal, the strategy required a precise balance, holding defensive lines long enough to prevent Soviet penetration into the breakout corridor, while concentrating sufficient combat strength to pierce the Soviet outer ring. Inside the pocket, preparations were carried out under constant Soviet pressure. Troops in secondary sectors were ordered to thin their lines and move westward, leaving only minimal forces to delay Soviet advances from the north and east. Supplies were consolidated, with the last reserves of fuel earmarked for tanks and half-tracks that would spearhead the breakout. Wounded soldiers capable of movement were integrated into marching columns, while the severely wounded were left in field hospitals with medical staff, a decision reflecting the harsh realities of the situation. Destroying heavy equipment that could not be moved became a priority to prevent capture. On the Soviet side, reconnaissance detected the concentration of German forces. Commanders of the 4th Guards Army, the 5th Guards Tank Army, and supporting rifle divisions began reinforcing suspected breakout points. Anti-tank ditches were deepened, minefields expanded, and artillery batteries were pre-sighted on likely approach routes. Cavalry mechanized groups were held in reserve to move rapidly against any penetration. The three Panzer Corps, having fought for over 10 days to break through Soviet blocking positions, launched renewed attacks on 15th February. The 1st and 16th Panzer Divisions, supported by artillery and close air support, advanced toward the villages of Oktyabr and Cherepakovka, which lay astride the most direct route to the pocket. Progress was made in bitter house-to-house fighting, but Soviet defenders counterattacked repeatedly, forcing the Germans to commit every available reserve. The relief force inched closer. By the evening of the 15th, their leading elements were within approximately 7 kilometers of the pocket's outer defenses. Weather and terrain added to the difficulties on both sides. The ground, churned by continuous shelling and vehicle movement, turned to mud in some areas while remaining frozen in others, creating hazardous conditions for maneuver. The Gniloy-Tikich River, swollen with meltwater, posed a formidable obstacle for any large-scale movement of troops and vehicles, especially for those attempting to escape under fire. Air activity intensified over the breakout sector. The Luftwaffe concentrated its remaining fighter strength to protect supply drops and provide close support for the relief effort. Soviet aircraft, in turn, targeted German assembly areas inside the pocket and struck roads and bridges leading toward the front line, seeking to disrupt the timing of any breakout. By 16th February, the situation had reached a critical point. Inside the pocket, German units were assembled for the breakout attempt, organized into assault groups with armor at the front and infantry following in column formation. Outside, the 30 Panzer Corps prepared to make one final push to close the gap. Soviet High Command anticipated that the confrontation in the coming days would be decisive, and ordered its forces to hold the outer ring at all costs while maintaining unrelenting pressure on the inner perimeter. Both sides understood that the next 48 hours would decide whether the German encircled forces could escape or whether the Korsun pocket would be completely sealed and destroyed. On 17 February 1944, the German breakout from the Korsun pocket began in full force. At dawn, under cover of darkness and a light snow, General Stemmermann's concentrated strike group moved west from the Shenderovka area toward the Gniloy Tikich River. The spearhead consisted of the last operational tanks and assault guns, fewer than a dozen, supported by motorized infantry in half-tracks, followed by marching columns of infantry, artillery crews, and supply personnel. Behind them came horse-drawn wagons and stragglers, forming a long, vulnerable procession. The movement was coordinated to coincide with the 3rd Panzer Corps' renewed assault from the west, intended to split Soviet blocking positions and link with the encircled troops. The breakout plan aimed to achieve speed and surprise. German units within the pocket left minimal rearguards to delay Soviet pursuit from the east, while the main body moved rapidly toward the anticipated relief point near Cherepakovka. The Soviets, however, had already identified signs of concentration and were on high alert. Artillery from the 4th Guards Army and 5th Guards Tank Army opened heavy fire on German assembly areas as the movement began, inflicting casualties even before the leading elements reached the first Soviet lines. In the initial hours, the German spearhead managed to penetrate the outer Soviet defenses in several places, using armor to overrun anti-tank positions and infantry to clear trenches and strongpoints. Some Soviet rifle units, surprised by the intensity and focus of the assault, were forced back toward secondary positions. However, the narrowness of the breakout corridor and the congested movement of mixed combat and non-combat elements slowed progress. This allowed Soviet artillery and mortars to concentrate fire on the densely packed columns. Meanwhile, the 3rd Panzer Corps attacked from the west with the 1st and 16th Panzer Divisions, supported by the 17th Panzer Division on the flank. Fighting was fierce around the villages of Oktyabr and Cherepakovka, where Soviet defenders used minefields, prepared positions, and anti-tank guns to delay the advance. Luftwaffe fighters and ground attack aircraft provided close support, strafing Soviet gun positions and supply routes, while the 2nd Soviet Air Army targeted German armor and supply convoys with bombs and rockets. By midday, the gap between the relief force and the breakout group had narrowed to roughly 5 kilometers. However, Soviet counterattacks by elements of the 5th Guards Tank Army and Mechanized Corps struck the flanks of the advancing German columns, forcing them to halt repeatedly to repel these threats. This slowed the momentum of both the inner breakout and the outer relief effort. Communications between the two German forces were limited to radio intercepts and liaison aircraft, and coordination became. The Gniloy Tikich River, partially thawed and swollen with icy water, emerged as a critical obstacle. German engineers attempted to prepare fording points, but under constant Soviet fire, progress was slow and hazardous. Tanks and vehicles risked becoming mired or immobilized, while infantry faced the prospect of wading across in freezing conditions. Soviet artillery observers, positioned on higher ground, directed fire onto the crossing sites, inflicting severe losses. By the evening of 17th of February, both the Breakout Group and the relief force had sustained heavy casualties and lost much of their armor. The gap between them remained unclosed, with Soviet forces still holding critical ground in between. Nevertheless, the Germans inside the pocket had managed to advance several kilometers westward, reducing the distance to potential. The coming day would be decisive, as exhaustion, ammunition shortages, and the deteriorating weather compounded the already immense challenges facing the encircled troops. The Soviet command, determined to prevent a full breakout, ordered fresh attacks for the following morning, aiming to seal the fate of the Korsun pocket once and for all. On 18th of February 1944, the battle for the Korsun pocket reached its critical turning point. At first light, German forces inside the encirclement resumed their desperate push westward from the Shenderovka sector. The assault was spearheaded by the last remaining armored vehicles, supported by concentrated infantry formations, with artillery units firing their remaining shells before destroying or abandoning their guns. The breakout column was now compressed into a narrow corridor, moving through snow-covered fields and small villages under constant Soviet artillery fire. The Gniloy-Tikich River lay directly ahead, representing both the final barrier to freedom and the most dangerous phase of the escape. The Soviet High Command had anticipated this renewed effort and reinforced the blocking positions between the pocket and the 3 Panzer Corps. Elements of the 4th Guards Army, the 5th Guards Tank Army, and several rifle divisions occupied strong defensive lines along the approaches to the river, supported by pre-sighted artillery and anti-tank guns. Soviet armored brigades were held in reserve to counterattack any German penetration. Throughout the morning, Soviet aircraft from the 2nd and 5th Air Armies patrolled the area, striking concentrations of troops and vehicles attempting to close the gap to the relief force. Inside the pocket, the breakout began with a violent clash at the forward Soviet positions. German armor attempted to punch holes in the line, while infantry cleared trenches and machine gun nests in close combat. Initial gains were made, with several Soviet positions overrun, but the density of defending forces and the volume of fire slowed progress. Each kilometer forward was costly, with the column suffering constant casualties. The mixed nature of the force, combat units, wounded soldiers, supply wagons, and non-combat personnel added to the difficulty of maintaining speed and cohesion. At the same time, the 30 Panzer Corps launched its final push from the west, attacking toward Cherepakovka, with the 1st and 16th Panzer Divisions in the lead. Despite heavy losses in previous days, these formations advanced several kilometers under fierce resistance. However, Soviet counterattacks on their flanks and the muddy, broken terrain slowed their progress. By midday, the relief force was still approximately 5 to 7 kilometers from the nearest elements of the breakout group. The decisive moment came in the afternoon when the water, icy and swollen from thaw, was waist to chest deep in most places, with strong currents. Engineers attempted to build makeshift crossings, but under constant Soviet fire, This proved slow and hazardous. Many soldiers attempted to ford the river directly, discarding equipment to keep from being swept away. Vehicles that tried to cross often became stuck or were abandoned midstream. Soviet artillery observers, positioned on the high ground, directed accurate fire into the crossing points, inflicting heavy casualties. Amid the chaos, coordination between the breakout force and the relief force broke down entirely. The 3 Panzer Corps was unable to break through the Soviet lines in time to secure the river crossings, and the distance between the 2 German groups remained unbridged. Soviet forces exploited this gap, moving additional. By nightfall, portions of the breakout group had managed to cross the Gniloy-Tikich, but in a disorganized and fragmented manner. Many units lost cohesion during the crossing, with stragglers and isolated groups left behind on the eastern bank. Thousands were captured by Soviet troops, who moved in behind the failed breakout. The exhausted survivors on the western bank faced the challenge of making their way to friendly lines across open terrain still contested by Soviet patrols. The day's fighting had brought the pocket to the brink of destruction, with only a fraction of the encircled force now having any realistic chance of reaching safety. By 19th of February 1944, the Korsun pocket had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent German fighting force. The breakout attempt of the previous 2 days had left the encircled formation shattered, with survivors scattered across both banks of the Gniloy-Tikich River. Those who had managed to cross during the chaotic fighting on 17 to 18th of February now faced an exhausting trek through snow-covered fields and enemy-controlled territory to reach the advancing elements of the 3rd Panzer Corps. Many were in small, disorganized groups, lacking heavy weapons and short on ammunition. Soviet patrols and blocking detachments roamed the countryside, capturing or killing stragglers. The 3 Panzer Corps, depleted after more than 2 weeks of continuous combat, made limited advances on 19th of February, but was unable to clear a safe corridor for the retreating troops. Soviet forces from the 4th Guards Army and 5th Guards Tank Army maintained firm control over the high ground and key road junctions west of the river, preventing any large-scale link-up. Some small groups of German soldiers managed to slip through gaps in Soviet lines, often at night, but these movements were uncoordinated and costly. Inside the former pocket, Soviet rifle divisions completed mopping-up operations. Villages that had been strong points only days earlier were now littered with abandoned equipment, burned-out tanks, destroyed artillery pieces, and hundreds of vehicles left in the snow. Soviet troops captured thousands of prisoners, including wounded soldiers and rear-area personnel who had been unable to participate in the breakout. Among the dead was General Wilhelm Stemmermann, killed when his command vehicle was hit by artillery fire during the retreat toward the river. Casualty figures for the battle vary, but Soviet records indicate that of the approximately 60,000 German troops encircled, around 30,000 were killed or captured during the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky operation. German sources suggest that roughly 35,000 men escaped, many in poor condition and without their heavy weapons. Soviet forces also suffered significant losses, with estimates exceeding 80,000 killed, wounded, and missing, along with hundreds of tanks and assault guns damaged or destroyed during the fighting. The immediate aftermath for the German army was severe. The destruction of HC and Exter's corps within the pocket, combined with the heavy losses suffered by 30 Panzer Corps during the relief attempt, weakened Army Group South's ability to hold central Ukraine. The loss of manpower, armor, and artillery was compounded by a sharp drop in morale, as the failure to extract the trapped troops underlined the growing inability to respond effectively to large-scale Soviet offensives. For the Soviet side, the battle was hailed as a major operational success. It eliminated a substantial German force, secured a broad section of the Dnieper's western bank, and set the stage for further advances into western Ukraine. Politically, the encirclement and destruction at Korsun were compared in Soviet media to the victory at Stalingrad, reinforcing the image of the Red Army's capacity to conduct deep, decisive operations. The humanitarian cost was immense. Local populations in the battle area faced devastation. Entire villages destroyed, farmland rendered unusable by craters and mines, and surviving civilians displaced in the depths of winter. Recovery in the region would take years, and the scars of the fighting would remain visible long after the front had moved west. Historically, the Korsun pocket is remembered as one of the last large-scale encirclements of German forces in Ukraine before the Red Army's push into Poland and the Balkans. It demonstrated the Soviet mastery of operational encirclement and the declining capacity of the Wehrmacht to respond to such maneuvers. While some German units fought their way out, the battle's outcome confirmed that the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front was now firmly in Soviet hands.